Hello, P Street people, and again, whoever else might be joining us here on this live stream or maybe later in the recording. All of this gets archived on both Facebook and our YouTube channel, our Facebook page and our YouTube channel. We are going to continue our study of the book of Leviticus, and I'm just spending 5 Sunday nights considering this book. We did an introduction the first Sunday night of the month. Last Sunday we dove into God's holiness and looking at what that is and how that is the baseline to the book of Leviticus. And it helps us, I think, understand why God provides all of these instructions and all of these laws for his people, Israel. And what I want to do tonight is, and I'm calling this lesson "Strange Laws," because there are some strange things going on in Leviticus that kind of shock or give 21st century readers pause. Now, many of the laws and regulations in the book of Leviticus make sense to us. Like don't commit adultery, or don't commit incest, or don't curse your parents, or don't sacrifice your children. I mean, that makes sense to us. We would understand why God would prohibit those things. When it comes to maintaining ritual purity, we talked about the idea of ritual or ceremonial purity, and how there are a lot of things in that category that are frankly unavoidable, but the instruction was given what you do if you do become ritually impure. And a lot of these make sense to us, that that God would require certain purification measures for like skin diseases or certain bodily discharges or moldy houses. We can make sense of that stuff. The sacrificial system with which Leviticus opens could give a lot of us pause. There's a specificity to it that sort of overwhelms us. And then you've got the killing of animals that may disturb you. Certainly disturbs certain people, certain groups of people. And we're going to talk more about the sacrificial system in next week's lesson. But perhaps the strangest, maybe most interesting section of laws in the book of Leviticus is in Leviticus 11. And that's what we're going to focus on this evening for a few moments. Okay? So, here is what we might call Leviticus 11. We could call it God's menu for Israel. And we might ask the question, why would God go to such a length as to regulate the diet of his people? What's interesting is his sort of breakdown is not necessarily going to reflect what doctors might do today if they told you, here's a list of foods you should eat and here's a list of foods you shouldn't eat. There's just some interesting things going on, and it's breaking down between clean and unclean animals. And we got questions, why give them a menu, so to speak? Well, just from the outset, one of the things to consider is that human beings, you, me, it's true of Israel, one of the things we do about as often as any other thing is eat. And so you can imagine that At every meal, Israel was reminded of her call to holiness. At every meal, by what they were consuming, refusing to consume, God regulated every aspect of Israelite life. I mean, here he is. He's literally trying to live in the camp. His presence is dwelling in their midst there in that tent of meeting. And here's what he is what he needs from them, because as we said last week, this is kind of a dangerous situation. And so in his grace, he's here's what you're going to do, here's what you're not, and he's regulating everything, and he regulates their food between what would make them ritually pure, maintain that pureness, or ritually impure. Plants and vegetables are not even discussed that I can remember in my reading of Leviticus 11. It's not talked about. But the focus is on animals and even insects. God permitted the Israelites to eat certain animals and insects, and he prohibited the Israelites from eating certain animals and insects. Leviticus 11, verses 46 through 47, I think summarizes the focus of the chapter. This is the law about beast and bird and every living creature that moves through the waters and every creature that swarms on the ground, to make a distinction between the unclean and the clean, and between the living creature that may be eaten and the living creature that may not be eaten. Now, those words do echo something you see in the chapter prior to Leviticus 11 and Leviticus 10, which is in the section of the discussion about the ordination of the priesthood, and there is talk about what they would be responsible for. So, for instance, in Leviticus 10, verses 10 through 11, we read of God's instruction to the priests. You are to distinguish between the holy and the common, and between the unclean and the clean, and you are to teach the people of Israel all the statutes that the Lord has spoken to them by Moses. So that's, in essence, what chapter 11 is about. God's regulating their eating habits. Now, before we dive into the text a little more and kind of pull out some of its strangeness, I guess, we're going to play a little game, okay? Now, it's a game that's going to test your knowledge of the dietary restrictions commanded in Leviticus 11. So you don't want to you don't have your Bible open here. Let's just kind of, we're going to do this, and we'll see after the fact how you did. What we're going to do is I'm going to say the name of an animal, and I'm going to give you a picture of it as well. And then you're just going to write down somewhere, maybe if you're watching this on TV, or if you got a phone hand, you can put it in your note list, but it's just to kind of keep a list. I'm going to give you 10 animals / insects, and you're going to put yes or no. Yes, Israel could eat this. No, Israel could not eat this. Okay? And now, some of these you'll go, why would they want to eat that? This is not we're not really asking the question of would they eat it, but could they eat it if they wanted to. And after we've gone through it, we'll see how you did. In fact, if you want to, you could put in the comment section, whether you're on YouTube or Facebook, how many you got right. Some of you might get all of these. Some of you are going to be like, man, there's no way he was regulating that, specific, but you'll see. We'll see. So with that, let's play a little game. Here's the first one, okay? Could the Israelites eat an eagle? Was an eagle on the menu for Israel? What about the pig? Now, this ought to be probably the easiest one in the bunch. Could Israel, could the Hebrew people, the Jews, could they eat pig? And of course, Pig gives you such wonderful products as ham and bacon and pork. It's good stuff, right? Third one, deer. Could the Israelites eat deer or no? Some venison. Was that on the menu? Here's the fourth one, a sardine. Could they open up a can of sardines and eat sardines? Obviously, they didn't have cans of sardines like we do, but was a sardine on the menu? Here's the fifth one. What about duck? I remember going to P.F. Chang's one time, and duck was on the menu. I think it still is. Maybe you've eaten some duck recently. I don't know. But could you eat a duck if you were a part of the Israelite community? We're going to switch here to insects here. What about a grasshopper, a locust? Could you eat a grasshopper if you wanted to? Maybe some of you have eaten a grasshopper. I think you can order this stuff online now. Comes in it's kind of like dried, you know what I'm saying, like dried insects. They're like dried out seasoned. I'm sorry if you haven't eaten or were trying to eat while watching this. But anyway, could you eat a grasshopper, a locust? What about a camel? Was a camel? This is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. This is number 7. Could you eat a camel? What about a chameleon? Could you eat a chameleon if you wanted to? According to the guidelines given in Leviticus 11. And those guidelines will come, there's some more that come about. I mean, they overlap, essentially identical with Deuteronomy 14, I believe. So here you go. What about a chameleon? Number 9. What about shrimp? In fact, we'll let shrimp sort of represent the others, like crab or lobster. Could you eat crab, lobster, and shrimp? Yes or no? I love shrimp, y'all. I love seafood. It's hard for me to pass up seafood. And when I'm saying seafood, I often think of like shrimp, right? And crab meat and things like that. Scallops, So what about it? Could you eat shrimp if you were part of the Israelite community? And they're in the Old Testament. And then finally, what about turkey? Jeremy, our youth minister, loves the turkey hunt. Loves it. Just loves it. Do you, or could you? Could you eat a turkey? All right, so here's our list of animals. Okay, let me bring this up here. And you won't see my face for a little bit, but let me go down the line here. We'll start from left to right and go down. All right, so if you're playing along, this is no fun if you weren't playing along. Eagle, yes or no? That's a big no. Can't eat eagles. No, not if you were Israelite. Pig? No. A pig was a no. You could not eat a pig. In fact, the pig gets called out specifically in Leviticus 11 as a don't eat it. Deer, you could eat deer. Deer was on the menu. A sardine was a yes. It was on the menu. A duck was on the menu. That's a yes. And the grasshopper or locust, okay? The cricket, yes, you could eat that if you wanted to. The camel, that's going to be a big no. Not to consume camel. Chameleon, no. In fact, chameleon does get a specific shout out in Leviticus 11, along with the gecko. Okay, the shrimp was a no. You could not eat shrimp. You could not eat lobster. You could not eat crab. And some of you are weeping at the thought of not being able to snap a crab leg and eat that delicious sweet meat. And then turkey was yes. Okay, a turkey was yes. So hey, If you did that little exercise and you want to share how well you did, maybe you got one right, maybe you got five, maybe you got eight. Hey, just for some fun, put that down there in the comments section. So, and when we were going through those animals, you're like, I mean, how did, why, there's questions of God. What was he doing here to make these distinctions? And we'll talk about that in a second. But before we do, let me just give you a very brief overview of Leviticus 11. And really, I'm just focusing on where there is the distinctions being made. And I found a chart online that I found to be pretty helpful, and you probably can see this fairly well. And you'll notice this chart is not so much in the order of appearance in Leviticus 11. It starts in the air, goes to the insects, the land, and the water. But this is the essentially the categories that Leviticus 11 deals with: the air, the insects, the land, and the water. And this provides you a neat little way of how to kind of decipher between an animal you could eat and an animal that you could not eat. When it came to, in Leviticus 11, beginning about 13, for, regulating the birds of the air, basically what the text does, it just lists all the birds you can't eat. So if it's not listed there, if the bird you're considering, consuming is not listed in those verses, then it was okay. It was okay to eat. And I know that's pretty small writing, but you'll see things like the eagle, buzzards, and vultures, that feed on carrion, that are, they eat dead animals and stuff. Those were no owls. You couldn't eat a seagull. And of course, a bat. Weren't supposed to eat a bat. And a lot of these you're going, well, that's okay, because I wasn't planning on eating any of those anyway. But there you go. Insects. You'll notice the way this breaks down, and this is in verses 20 through 23, Leviticus 11. Questions asked: has it got four walking legs? If no, then you don't eat it. If it's yes, then you got something else to consider. Does it have this joint, kind of like your crickets and your grasshoppers, does it have this jointed jumping legs? If you get a yes on that, then that was clean to eat. If not, that was a no. So that's kind of strange, right? Interesting. The land animals, there were two things that were kind of were discussed in the text as far as delineating between clean and unclean land animals. And this is kind of the first set of animals that are covered in Leviticus 11. It is the hoof split. If yes, then you're on the way to a clean animal. If not, you're not eating it. And then another question was, does it chew the cud? Is it a herbivore? Is sort of what comes out there. If yes, you're eating it. So you could eat a cow. You could have your steak and all of that. So you get a yes on that. But if it didn't chew the cud, let's say its hoof was split, but it didn't chew the cud, that was a no. And the animal that does fit that is a pig. A pig gets a yes initially, but then gets a no because it doesn't chew the cud, and that is discussed in Leviticus 11. So the pig was off limits. And then of the water, and there were a couple of delineations here. Has to do with fins and scales. You had to have fins and scales. So this is why the lobster and the crab and the shrimp could not be eaten, because they're not bringing fins and scales to the table. Sardine has fins and has scales. However small that might be, you could eat that. So this is, in a nutshell, this is how you would distinguish between clean and unclean meats. Again, this was something the priests were responsible for making sure the people were following and getting right. The people certainly needed to have awareness of this as well. And one of the things we might add here is in the case of consuming a clean animal, one of the things you could not do was consume the blood. And so Leviticus 17, another chapter, gets into that. And the reason why is because blood essentially symbolized life. Life is in the blood. And so God would prohibit that. And he did that with any animal. I mean, you could eat the unclean ones, but even the clean ones, you weren't supposed to consume the blood. Now, when you're looking at this list of things, you start to have some questions. And one of the questions that's kind of nagged scholars and Bible students and things is, was there some sort of organizing principle? What made this animal clean and these animals unclean? Now, we have God's distinctions, right? But we begin to ask questions like, why? Did God have an organizing principle for his distinction between clean and unclean animals? On what basis? I mean, God does give us the the fish have to have fins and they have to have scales. If they don't, but we're going, is there something else at work here as to why he decided to go with fins and scales and not deem, let's say, shrimp, locust, and all of that as clean? And that, you see what I'm saying? There's just people wanting to know what's his basis for these distinctions, and people ask a lot of questions. Why? Let me interject this. A preacher friend of mine brought this up, which is real good. There's a lot of stuff we confront in Scripture where we ask why. And the thing that's tough in answering this question in Leviticus 11 is God doesn't just spell it out. He doesn't explicitly state, the reason why I'm considering these animals unclean is X and these animals clean, as Y. And so we struggle sometimes trying to understand what's going on in God's mind. We have that knack for asking why. And why is okay. Why is a good question. And probing into that is not wrong. But we have to be careful we don't ask why as a condition of obedience. This is where we can get ourselves in trouble with God. This is how kids, frankly, get in trouble with their parents. What we're saying is sometimes we ask why because we're like, well, God, you're asking us to do something here. Let's say from a New Testament perspective. I'd like for you to tell me why, and if I like your answer, then I'll obey you. It's not how this works. And the same goes for those living in this old covenant. By the way, the last lesson we'll deal with is the fact that a better covenant, the new covenant, has come and is superseded or replaced or made the old one obsolete. We're going to talk about that in the last lesson of our Leviticus series. But here I'm just saying, why is an okay question, but never ask it as a condition of obedience. Like you're like, hey, Chapman, go clean your room. Why? Well, because it's dirty, or we might play that game of trying to answer that question, but it's like sometimes you get this feeling that children are asking why because they're considering whether or not they're going to obey you. They're going to wait to see if they like your answer to your question. It doesn't work that way, right? And it doesn't work that way with God. So we want to know why. We want to understand why God makes the distinctions that he does. And what I want to do is just share with you some of the ideas that people have had. And I find these kind of interesting as to where these distinctions potentially come from, what the organizing principle might have been. All right, so here some have considered maybe it was theological. In other words, the thought here is that God considered unclean those animals associated with pagan religions that were taboo for Israel. In other words, animals associated with non Israelite rituals and ceremonies were prohibited. Now, while there were some differences in the animals, some have highlighted that pigs would often be used, let's say, in sacrifice. I mean, another thing about this is the animals that are being excluded are animals that would not be worthy of sacrificing to God. In other words, you could sacrifice clean animals. You could not sacrifice unclean animals. Not only could you not eat the unclean animals, you couldn't sacrifice them to God. And so there is some evidence that some of the pagan religions used unclean animals, as God would define it, in their sacrificial ritual services. But there's also overlap. There's a lot of similarities that exist between the practices of course, the Israelites and their non-Israelite pagan neighbors. So where we might say, okay, a lot of what people say generally about Leviticus is that God is wanting his people to be holy, yes, and unique, yes, and different from the surrounding nations, yes, but as to whether that right there captures all of these distinctions that God is making, I don't think it's true for all of it. Here's another thing, morphological. So here we're talking about kind of like the features of an animal. So anthropologists who have studied Leviticus 11 have suggested that animals were considered clean or unclean depending on whether they possessed the morphological features that made them quote unquote normal in a category or in their category. So Mary Douglas is an anthropologist that's often cited for this view. She writes, the dietary code rejects creatures which are anomalous, whether in living between two spheres or having defining features of members of another sphere or lacking defining features. So the clean species must have all the necessary criteria of its class. If God rejects the animal which lacks the crucial and distinguishing characteristics of its species, how much more will he reject one who tries to live in two worlds, the anomalous believer? So some look at this as morphological, that that God has this, that there is this these perfect features that exist for a class of animals, and those animals that do not exhibit the best of those features, those are the ones that get left out. But yes, there are some of these animals that we look at and go, vulture. Yeah, that's not good. A buzzard. But it's to say that this covers all of it is probably going too far. It is, I think, going too far. And then, of course, the meaning they attach to this, that you got these animals that are kind of trying to exist with features in two different spheres, and that's representative of a believer who's trying to live with one foot in the world and one foot, in holiness. Again, a lot of what we're discussing here, all really of what we're discussing here, is speculative, because again, God doesn't really pull the curtain back and say, "Hey guys, here's my thinking on this." Okay, here's the third one, ethical. So several scholars have highlighted, and this is interesting, the eating habits of the animals excluded. So herbivores, for the most part, are included. You could eat them. They chew the cud. Okay? Carnivores, on the whole, are excluded. Those animals that eat other animals. or feed on the carcasses of dead animals are excluded. So, in short, beasts of prey, predators, are excluded. And so, not a few people have said, that God excludes those animals whose behavior would be unbecoming of human beings. In other words, unlike these predatory animals, human beings shouldn't consume blood or prey on the weak. And now that'll preach, right? That maybe behind, that at least one of the organizing principles in God's mind was excluding carnivores because their habit, their eating habits, if we were to kind of take that and then sort of extrapolate that and look at the behavior of humans, not so much thinking in terms of cannibalism, but in this sort of predatory taking advantage of the weak and all of this, that maybe that's why I'm calling this sort of the ethical view here. But that doesn't explain all of the information and distinctions given in Leviticus 11. Some just say it's a matter of aesthetic. Of course, this is very subjective. They would say animals whose appearance is repulsive were excluded from the dinner table. A rabbit. You couldn't eat a rabbit. The hare, Hare. I think most people consider rabbits to be, some would consider them adorable, or they like to pet. Certainly we wouldn't consider a rabbit to be repulsive, okay? And there are people that have baby pigs, they like having them around and even have them in the house for some reason. But and of course, all of us probably could get on board with a vulture or something being nasty. And then one of the things we didn't discuss earlier in our little breakdown there, that chart, was there are the swarming things that are discussed in Leviticus 11. That's where you get into your gecko and your monitor, your lizards, and but there are certain lizards and amphibians or whatever that some people consider to be cute. So I don't know, aesthetic. That seems like that's far fetched. This is hygienic. This is probably one of the most cited reasons for the distinctions made. And the idea is that those animals that were more likely to be carriers of disease were excluded from Israel's diet. Maimonides, he was a 12th century Jewish philosopher and theologian. He illustrates this emphasis. He writes, "These ordinances seek to retrain us in the mastery of our appetite. All food which the Torah has forbidden us to eat have some bad and damaging effect on the body." It's true that some of these animals, I don't know of any of us that would say that bacon is the most healthy food in the world. It's delicious, but I don't know if we could classify it as healthy per se. And so we have to be probably careful. Maybe this is one of the principles working. God certainly does exclude some animals from Israel's diet that was good for them not to have on the table, okay? But I don't think it explains everything. And then one last thing that's been suggested is going at it from a kind of a symbolic view. So you do have the split hoof rule for land animals, right? Some just kind of capitalize on the hoof rule, that you got to have a hoof, not paws. So like cat, a dog, a wolf, they were excluded because they had paws. Their raw foot essentially was touching the ground. Whereas hoofed animals, they had sort of a separator between their raw foot and the ground. And so some scholars, getting more in the symbiology, they go, well, the ground was cursed at the fall. Genesis 3. By Genesis 4, we have the first murder, and it's like the ground is ingesting the blood of Abel. And so some say that God, the symbol here is that these animals that were hooved, there was a separation from, not touching the ground, which essentially was defiled. And so that was a part of God's thinking. Here's the thing, does God like symbols and stuff? He absolutely does. I mean, we see memorials and symbols all throughout Scripture. We even have baptism that it symbolizes something. We have the Lord's Supper. It symbolizes something. Okay, things are actually being accomplished. It's not just raw symbols, but so some say that the split hoof was basically saying that there's to be a separation between the Israelite and unholiness. That the Israelites to be separated from her pagan, unholy neighbors. But that's a distinction you could make as general as just the clean and unclean distinction. And then not a few have said that these snakes and all of this were excluded because like the amphibians or lizards, because they're reminiscent of serpents, which is a symbol of sin. So that's why those got excluded. Here's the thing, you cannot, in looking at Leviticus 11, there is no way that you can pick one principle and say this explains all of the distinctions that God makes. It's not possible. It could be a combination of some of these things we've discussed. In fact, here's what Gary Schnitger said concerning Leviticus 11. He said the traditional view holds that the distinctions are arbitrary from the standpoint of human logic. There is no intrinsic reason why the clean are clean. That is, the clean are clean and the unclean are clean because God said so. Now, even with that, we still go, but why, right? We'll come back full circle here. These Israelites, when they were given these distinctions, like us, they might have questioned, why that? Why did he not? Why don't we get to eat that? And why do we get to eat this? What's he? Hey, he never said. And it really does kind of come down to this, right? Hey, that's clean because God said it's clean, and that's unclean because God said it's unclean. Whatever else might be at play here, I've got to listen to him, and I've got to submit, and I've got to honor this call to holiness, even in what I've got on the dinner table. That's the thinking that the Israelites, those people, were supposed to have. Now, I know it's kind of an interesting subject matter, I guess. Some of you are like, I could go without a study of Leviticus 11, as strange as these laws may be. But it does raise the question as we're kind of bringing this to an end. Because there are a lot of people today, even here in the 21st century, some claiming to be, profess some relationship to Christianity, who are quite adamant that we are supposed to continue observing these laws relative to food. So you have some today who are not going to eat pork. Okay, now certainly Jews consider these, continue these practices, but we're thinking, okay, well, what about us? And I realize this kind of, in some ways, dovetails into what we'll discuss in the last lesson in this series, but I think it's worth highlighting here. And I think a real important passage that everybody's got to deal with is Mark 7. And before I take you to what Jesus says here, let me give you a little background to Mark 7. You had these Pharisees who, as you know, they were quite meticulous in their observance of the law, and even in their observance of the laws they created to kind of create this hedge about the law. And they had created their own laws, and at times obscuring God's law or obscuring the intention of God's law. So it wasn't so much that you couldn't eat this and couldn't eat, you could eat this and you couldn't eat that. That was true of the Pharisees, but it had gotten down into washing rituals and things of this nature, and then the focus become sort of almost not exclusively, but a lot of their focus became sort of this external holiness, that the means of holiness and drawing near to God is in a lot of these external rituals and ceremonies. And then Jesus comes along, and his disciples are eating with unwashed hands, God forbid it. And the Pharisees are upset. And so they got to question Jesus about this, if they can trip him up. Why do your disciples transgress the tradition of the elders? No, they're not really talking here about the law itself, but they've got a scruple here, and they'd like to discuss it with Jesus. And then Jesus takes an opportunity to lay down, some call it sort of a new Torah. Here's what he said. Do you not see whatever goes into a person from outside cannot defile him, since it enters not his heart but his stomach and is expelled? And then you have this parenthetical statement. This is the ESV. And here's it appears to be sort of marks aside here. Thus he, Jesus, declared all foods clean. Now, that little parenthetical statement has occasioned no shortage of discussion. The KJV doesn't have that parenthetical statement. It just says, and thus, or purging all meats, or cleansing all food is maybe a literal sort of translation of it. And it's kind of tacked on the end, and people have raised questions how best to translate this. Is this, in fact, in my mind, it doesn't matter which way you translate this. Whether you've got it as something that Jesus said, or if you've got it as an aside by the author himself as to the intention of what Jesus was, accomplishing here, or at least an implication of what Jesus was teaching here. But Jesus, he goes on. Let me see if we've got this. Notice what Jesus goes on to say. And he said, what comes out of a person is what defiles him. From within, out of the heart of man, come evil thoughts, sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, coveting, wickedness, deceit, sensuality, envy, slander, pride, foolishness. All these evil things come from within, and they defile a person. You notice Jesus' focus here. Jesus says, hey guys, what you put in your mouth is not going to ultimately, it's not going to defile you. As he says, it's going to go in your stomach. It's going to end up in the latrine. I know that's kind of crass, but it's Jesus talking here. In other words, that what you put, this food you put, it's not going and contaminating your heart. What contaminates your heart is disobedience. So it wasn't, with a clean and unclean food, the problem would have been in disobeying God, not paying attention to him, not taking him seriously and saying, he said, don't eat this, I'm going to eat it. That's disobedience. Food itself, okay? I mean, we've eaten pork, pig. I've ate a lot of it in my day. Is that literally intrinsically defiling me? No, it's not. The focus of Jesus would be the human heart, moral righteousness, the sinfulness of the righteousness of human beings, and loving God and loving their neighbor as theirself, all of which is there in the Old Testament. Of course, things do get interesting when God literally is going to come down, right, is presence is going to be in the tent of meeting. And there would be a lot of implications of that for Israel and what he was trying to do during that time. But according to Mark 7, okay, Jesus pronounced all food clean. You can, unless there's conscience stuff going on here, mind you, you can eat pork, you can eat shrimp, you can eat crab and lobster. I'm very thankful for these things. Maybe some people got some conscious stuff they can't do it. In fact, I want to close by just reminding us of something that happened in Acts 10. Okay? So in Acts 10, Peter goes up onto, the roof. He's going to lay down and take him a little nap. And he has a trifecta of visions. And the vision that comes 3 times is essentially this massive tablecloth coming down out of the sky, and there's all these animals on there. Unclean animals are present. And, God's trying to teach Peter something. In fact, he says, the voice of the vision says, "Rise, kill, and eat." And Peter's like, "No, I have never ate anything common or unclean. I'm not doing it." Now, granted, Jesus had already cleaned all meats, as it were. I'll come back to Schnitger. He said, in the case of Peter's vision, the point is not that God was now declaring all foods clean, for Jesus had already done that. Rather, the new teaching concerning the dietary regulations effectively removed one of the visible and social differences between Jews and Gentiles. Through his vision, Peter learned that he should preach the good news to Cornelius because God's word was being taken to the Gentiles. That table barrier was real. We don't eat what those Gentiles eat. God comes along in a vision. Not only is he telling Peter, hey, what you used to consider unclean, i.e. the Gentiles, we're going to go preach the gospel to them, the good news. Oh, and here's something to boot. Share a meal with them. It's okay. Something better is here. So, this is this discussion of Leviticus is interesting because there's so much in there that seems so foreign or strange or weird, or we got questions about, God seemed pretty serious about this. What about today? And we got all those kinds of questions. And so we're just taking some time this month to deal with some of those. I hope that this has been informative. I've never really taught a lesson on Leviticus 11 and just really dove into what folks are saying about the distinctions and all of that. But maybe this gives you something to think about. Maybe it raises some questions. Maybe you got some things you want to discuss further. I'd love to do that. If you got questions, let me know. I'll do my best to answer them. If I don't know the answer, I'll try to find the answer. And if I can't find the answer, then I'll talk to somebody I trust who studied this before. Okay, thanks for your attention, guys, and thanks for watching this evening.